President Biden is gearing up for yet another battle to try and get a huge spending plan through Congress. This one's for child care and education, what he calls human infrastructure. The issue is how to pay for the $1.5 trillion proposal. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes has more.
In roughly half the country, infant care is now more expensive than college tuition. To afford it, Brisandi Ruiz of Greenbelt, Maryland, works 7 days a week.
I feel bad because sometimes he tells me, Mommy, I want to play. And I can't because I have to work, otherwise he won't have a child care.
The White House is crafting the American Families Plan with parents like her in mind. It's a roughly $1.5 trillion proposal that would fund free pre-kindergarten and community college, extend the child tax credit, and create a national paid leave program. To pay for all that, they're considering raising the top marginal income tax rate and nearly doubling the capital gains rate for those making more than $1 million a year. Republicans are already pushing back. One called it a terrible idea that could actually lead to a decrease in tax revenues. The White House disagrees.
The president's calculation is that there's a need to invest in child care. There's a need to invest in early childhood education. His view is that that should be on the backs, that can be on the backs of the wealthiest Americans who can afford it and corporations and businesses who can afford it.
And Nancy joins me from the White House for more. Good to see you, Nancy. So you discussed these proposed tax increases, which are a non-starter for many Republicans. Are Democrats considering other ways to pay for these proposals, or do you think that they're going to try and use budget reconciliation once again to get this infrastructure bill passed?
Hi, Lana. Well, the challenge for Democrats is if they don't raise taxes, they don't have many other options to raise money to pay for these proposals. Really, the only other big direction you could go in would be to slash spending somewhere else, most likely in the domestic discretionary budget, and that's something that they are unwilling to do. So it's kind of raise taxes or bust. There are some Democrats, frankly, who argue that you shouldn't have to pay for the entire thing, that some of this infrastructure spending is going to boost the economy, and then that ends up paying for itself because businesses and individuals make more money and they end up paying more taxes. But regardless, right now the White House is arguing they do want to pay for it, and if they don't raise corporate taxes and they don't raise taxes on the wealthy, there are a few other options for them.
Well, Republicans have rolled out their counterproposal to President Biden's infrastructure plan with a $568 billion price tag. That's a little bit more than a quarter of the president's plan. Why is there such a wide gap between these two proposals?
Because Republicans think that the Democratic plan that the White House put forward is simply too big, too expensive. And so they spend money on some of the same things that the White House wants to spend money on, fixing roads and bridges and installing broadband and that kind of thing. They just spend less. And then they eliminate entirely some of the other initiatives that the White House feels are important, but that Republicans argue are outside the realm of traditional infrastructure. Things like boosting health care and addressing Medicaid. Republicans say that's not really infrastructure. It should go in some separate package. The White House argues it's all related because if you don't help people go to work, if you don't shore up some of the holes in the social safety net, that it makes it more difficult for everyone to get ahead. So that is really the crux of the difference here. And it is a massive gap. But interestingly, the White House is not sort of walking away from the Republican proposal the way it did the last time around with COVID relief. They're saying that they still want to engage with Republicans. They want to sit down and talk through their proposal and see if there is some bipartisan agreement to be reached, at least on parts of the infrastructure plan. And I asked Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, why it is that they have a different stance this time around. She said it's not an emergency the way it was with COVID relief. They felt that they really needed to meet the moment and go big, and that the Republican plan just simply wasn't enough for the problems that the country was facing. In this case, they still don't think it's enough, but they've got more time. This is not something that has to pass right away. And so they're willing to take the extra time, in this case, to engage with Republicans, even though, as you noted, these two sides are so far apart, it's hard to see how they would meet in the middle.
It does sound like they're at least exhibiting an interest in trying to compromise. Have they indicated, the White House or Republicans, any areas in which they may be willing to do so?
You know, it's really hard to see where that realm of compromise is right now, Lana, because even when you talk about how you pay for this spending, they are totally not on the same page. The way that Republicans are proposing paying for their much smaller package is with user fees. They don't want to touch either corporate or individual taxes. They just lowered those taxes a few years ago under President Trump, and they don't want to think about raising them again. They would instead try to raise money, so that using money, say, from people who, if they use a bridge, if they're on the roads, they pay tolls. If you use the airport, you end up paying a surcharge to fly out of that airport if it's been fixed up. But Democrats argue that the math is really fuzzy. You can't raise enough money that way, and that Republicans are cooking the books. Republicans turn around and accuse Democrats of trying to raise all this money off of U.S. corporations. They argue that's going to make the economy less efficient. So that is a real dividing line, and there is no sort of area where you say, oh, this is clearly where they're going to meet in the middle. It's hard to see how that compromise takes place. And yet, the White House just said today that the president is going to be sitting down with the Republicans who crafted that plan next week. And so they're going to continue talking and see if there's a deal to be made.
That reminds me, as you're talking about that, Nancy, about Press Secretary Jen Psaki's comments to you about raising it on the backs of corporations. I was surprised that she used the language on their backs. But I want to look forward in just the last moments that I have with you to next week, because as you mentioned, the president will roll out the American Family Plan during his address to a joint session of Congress. What else can we expect from that address?
If past State of the Unions and joint addresses are any guide, you are going to hear about every topic under the sun that is important to this White House. Yes, the centerpiece, of course, will be this new American Families Plan. They're withholding a lot of the details now because they'd like him to unveil those details with great fanfare in his speech next week. But beyond that, he'll talk about all the other things that are on his agenda. He'll talk about gun safety. He'll talk about immigration. He'll talk about health care. He's basically laying out his wish list, his agenda for the entire year. He'll talk about foreign affairs as well, to probably mention the fact that he has invited the president of Russia to sit down with him this summer. The interesting thing about this speech is that it is going to have such a different feel from the State of the Union addresses that we are so used to covering and watching here in Washington and around the country. The House chamber, by necessity, because we are in a pandemic, is going to be relatively empty. All of the lawmakers can't even attend, let alone their spouses, let alone guests, let alone the guests that the president himself normally invites and has seated up there in the gallery and points to and shares their inspiring stories. None of that will be happening this time around. And so the White House is going to have to find other ways to kind of convey the pomp and circumstance that usually surrounds these types of speeches. One thing that will be the same, Lana, is that like presidents before him, President Biden will be hitting the road the next day to try to sell some of the items on his agenda that he talks about in his speech the night before. So we're told he'll be going to Atlanta the following day, and that he's got more travel planned the day after that.
Sounds like we have a long night and a long week ahead of us. Nancy, thank you.
You're welcome.